Hi, everyone. My name is James Donaldson. I'm with the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation Spill Program, here to talk to you a little bit about our program, rules and regulations that are applicable to releases of hazardous materials in the state, a little bit about how our program operates, and also talk a little bit about some real world experiences we've had, specifically related to the flood events in 2023 and 2024. I am going to turn my camera off because it distracts the heck out of me looking at myself talking.
We're just looking at the slide part.
Okay, great. Perfect. So we'll start off with what is the law? There are several primary statutes and one current rule that are applicable to spill response in the state of Vermont. At the statutory level, we've got 66, 15, 16, and 17 that all present who is liable for a release of a hazardous material. They present reporting requirements, and they also mandate that there's a prohibition on the release of hazardous materials in the state of Vermont. I'll focus quickly on the reporting requirement. In statute, it says that any release of a hazardous material greater than or equal to 2 gallons or any lesser amount that impacts the environment or is a threat to human health must be reported to the state. 2 gallons is typically for your petroleum type products. Any lesser amount for an acute or a toxic substance such as mercury, just for a reference point for why that lesser amount is important. It also requires immediate reporting, and I want to touch a little bit on that more later. One common question we always get is, how do I know if it's 2 gallons or more? And our response is typically, it doesn't really matter. You're required to report more than 2 gallons, but it doesn't hurt to just give us a call if you have a spill. But quickly, for an example, this is 2 gallons of water that has been dumped onto a gravel surface. A stain is approximately 10 feet long, foot and a half wide. That is 2 gallons at what you might see at a gasoline station from a dispenser release, or even essentially like stained soil on the side of the roadway. When spills are reported, they come into the spill program through various means and methods. But from a high level perspective, the role of our program is to ensure that any environmental impact as well as human health impact is considered when there is a release of a hazardous material. We provide technical information on types of materials released, and we have a lot of experience and knowledge about different cleanup techniques depending on the product released and where it is released. And most importantly is that we ensure that environmental cleanups are completed to state standards. How do we do it? We have an 8-member team. I am essentially the only full-time spill program person in the state of Vermont. The other 7 members all are waste management and prevention division employees within the Department of Environmental Conservation. They are essentially part-timers. But we rotate in approximate 2-month shifts carrying the pager, pick it up on Wednesday morning, turn it off the following, or to hand it off the next Wednesday. So that way we provide 24/7 coverage for spill reporting to the state. During work days, that's usually accomplished through calling our switchboard number here, the 802 number. That will get to one of the Waste Management Prevention Division administrators who are well-versed in taking spill calls. Outside of business hours, the 800 number is the Vermont Hazmat Hotline, which is directed to the Vermont State Police Dispatch Center in Rockingham, where when they are reported a spill, when a release is reported to them, they in turn will contact Vermont Emergency Management's watch officer on duty, who will then notify the spill program. And also in certain situations, if specific criteria are met, they will report also, or they will notify the Vermont Hazardous Materials Response Program. So what we do when we get a call is we essentially provide assistance, and that's based on our experience, our training, our knowledge base, and a lot of available references we have, including external references that we can deploy. We really are more of a paper pushing sort of oversight entity. We do not have a strong boots on the ground presence. For larger spills, we often rely on Vermont Hazardous Materials Response Team for that on-the-ground response. However, we will respond to an incident if we are requested by the on-scene personnel managing the incident, the responsible party, or if it's a large enough, significant enough spill with significant threats to the environment or realized threats, such as a large volume release into surface water. Those are the types of incidences that we can respond to. The on-call member has a truck at their disposal with response materials. Granted, it's not quite as extensive as response contractors or VHMRT have in their possession, but we can get out and at least get things going in terms of our spill response. As I mentioned, I am the only full-time member of the team as the program manager. We have 7 other folks who are in the Waste Management Prevention Division in different programs, and they all essentially devote about 10% of their time to spill management. So out of an 80-hour pay week, they're expected to spend about 8 hours of their time doing spills, which is outside of their normal program responsibilities. Back to reporting requirements. As I mentioned, the state statute requires immediate reporting. There is some vagary and some nuance to that we'll touch on a little bit more. But essentially, the statute also requires that the responsible party or the one who controls the waste is required to report. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to rely on them to do that at their convenience. We encourage first responders or anyone who is involved in a release scenario that realizes that it needs to be reported and may need additional assistance, calls it in to one of those reporting numbers that were provided earlier on. Sometimes we do not have a known responsible party, and if that's the case, you happen upon a spill or first responders there and they don't know where it came from, who's responsible for it, they can certainly report that to us. We like to be notified immediately. However, we recognize, again, that's not always possible. But the sooner that we are notified, the sooner that we can start to assist and bring in additional resources. There is a secondary reporting requirement outside of reporting to the state, which is reporting releases that impact or threaten to impact the waters of the state. Those releases must be reported to the National Response Center. The National Response Center is essentially operated by the U.S. Coast Guard. In New England, that is handled by Sector Northern New England out of the Portland, Oregon base. So calls to the National Response Center are received. They take the information there, and then they have an email notification system that is subscription based. So anytime there's an NRC response or an NRC report that comes out, it is emailed to me and it's automatically forwarded to the rest of my team. We get those reports for all counties in the state of Vermont. We also get them for the abutting counties in New York, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, just in case they impact waterways that may potentially impact state of Vermont waters. National Response Center reports are sometimes the first time that we are hearing about spills as they happen because they're reported directly to the federal level as opposed to the state level.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Chief McAllister out of Windsor. If I'm calling because I have a spill, I got the Connecticut River, so on and so forth. And first place I'm going to call is the state EOC watch officer. Do they know to call all these people so I can worry about my scene versus making 6 different phone calls to 6 different people?
Yes, you can. So you're essentially calling either VEM or if you call the hazmat hotline, it will get to us, and that's totally acceptable as long as we hear about it. If you call it into the EOC or to the hazmat hotline and you don't have a response for an hour, then I would encourage you to have those other numbers handy so that you can get more directly to the spill program. Okay. It's not very often that people, first responders especially, don't have the ability to get in contact with us within 10 or 15 minutes of making the initial call.
Right. Now, you guys have called back for other stuff, but I'm just concerned about the release into waterways.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, waterways, you don't need to worry about calling the NRC. That is essentially the responsibility of the owner of the waste or the responsible party. And we frequently make that notification as a spill program to the NRC. So if you have an incident on the Connecticut River and you're managing the incident and you just want to let us know about it, we'll hang up and we'll call the NRC and let them know what's going on to the best of our knowledge. And so that notification is made. That's certainly something that we have in our toolbox that we do regularly. I hope that satisfies your question, sir.
It does. I didn't want to assume anything. Thank you.
Right on. Okay, so for smaller releases, if it's a gallon or 2 of something that you can readily address yourself or the fire department can readily address themselves, by all means, we're fine with someone doing a quick cleanup in a 15 minutes, hour and a half, getting it stabilized, getting it secured, getting it even fully cleaned up, and then calling us and telling us, hey, we had a spill and it's been cleaned up. That is completely acceptable. However, for larger releases or ones that provide for a more significant threat or impact, it's imperative that you get a hold of us sooner than later, because if you need those additional resources, we can call state contractors and get them out there. We can also notify VHMRT if they haven't been aware. So we have other groups that we can contact and just provide additional assistance and guidance for the incident at hand. Like I said, we have state contractors on speed dial essentially, and we can call them out whether or not we know who actually released the material, just to assist with the first response. So going back again, immediately, it's not. If you have something going on, spend some time trying to address it and understand it. If you can stop the release, or if you can even clean it up first, that is fine. Give us a call afterwards so that we're informed and we don't hear about it later and wonder what's going on. The reporting requirements, again, immediate. I just mentioned some subtle nuance there. You do have some ability to do some cleanup and then call us. And back to the chief's question, if you're not the responsible party, but you are a first responder, if there is no responsible party, or if, say, it's for example, a tractor trailer incident on the interstate and the driver has been taken away for medical services, certainly please give the call and to notify the state that the release has occurred so that we can continue to do what we need to do and assist. And again, same goes for the National Response Center. That, again, is the responsibility of the responsible party, but the spill program can make that notification to the NRC on the responsible party's behalf or on behalf of the state if there is no known responsible party. When to report these are a little redundant. For smaller spills, if you can clean it up yourself, give us a call within a few hours of it occurring. It's often better to just get it dealt with, and you can minimize the impacts by cleaning it up yourself with resources at hand instead of spending time on the phone and letting the spill linger and create additional impacts. And like I said, call us immediately or as soon as possible. For larger releases, say there's an open valve, by all means, please try to stop the valve or close the valve, stop the release before you pick up the phone and spend 5 minutes on the phone with us watching it continue to discharge from that valve. Briefly, our contact information, it's just for purposes of information. Our website does not have a reporting function, so please do not go to our website to report a spill. Again, our 24/7 number is the Vermont Hazmat line, which goes to VSP, our office number here, and the National Response Center. I put these in case this presentation is requested later for people for just having it in their back pocket. So when you call to make a spill report, we would love to know who you are, who you're with, and a contact number so we can get back to you after we've made some phone calls on our end. However, it's not imperative that you give us your information. You can make anonymous spill reports. We do get them on occasion, and we will do our best to maintain that anonymity throughout the response. If known, we like to know when the spill occurred or when the release occurred. The location is obviously the most critical. Facility or property name is fine. The so-and-so mobile on Route 7, it's great. If you have the E91 address, that is even better, especially for private properties where there's no real recognizable name for the parcel. Roadways, it's often difficult. Town roads, certainly try to get the closest possible residential or commercial address. And on the interstate or other town roads, or state roads where there are mile markers, that information is very helpful to have as well as a location, or even a landmark north of the exit 17 bridge, that sort of thing. If known, the responsible party information, that would include name, address, phone number of a contact for that owner of the waste. Ultimately, if there's no responsible party, going back to that tractor trailer incident, even with a DOT number, that is helpful to us because we can track down ownership details for the responsible party. We like to know how the release occurred, what product was released, Any general comments? Example, we've got oil on the river and there's a bunch of oil ducts. That's helpful information for us to be able to triage and figure out what entities we need to notify for assistance for the cleanup. If there have been actions taken, we've deployed absorbents, we close the valve, you can give us that information as well, and any other actions that were taken to either contain or clean up the release. And lastly, and perhaps most important, is our surface waters or dry drainages even impacted? If the reporter does not provide that information, my team is schooled and they're trained and they know they will ask that question before they hang up the phone with the reporter. So it's in general, it's not a lot of information that we need right off the bat. So in terms of cleanup requirements, in brief, if there is a release, the person in control or the responsible party, or in certain situations, the first responders, contain the releases as a best possible. Notify the state first, ideally. Any local authorities, if you want to reach out to the local fire department, they're going to be your fastest assistance on scene. And then lastly, obviously, the federal notification to the National Response Center. Once the immediate response has been done, take those additional cleanup actions required by any of the federal or state or local officials. And then finally take your final corrective actions, basically to make sure there's no additional discharge and that all contaminated environmental media has been remediated or is no longer present, providing for a continued threat to human health or the environment. How to clean up smaller spills. It's really handy to just have some granule absorbents like a kitty litter or speedy dry. Sand can be used. It's better to use sand to control migration of a spill as opposed to absorb a spill. And there's certain situations where we really don't want to use sand versus we want to use sand. That's something that can be a decision that can be made in consultation with the spill program. And any waste that is deployed must be containerized for proper disposal in accordance with state regulations. Larger spills, obviously, if you've got a large volume, say a tanker truck that's on its side and leaking, the immediate defense measures would include obviously trying to prevent the release from the vehicle or the vessel. Secondarily, creating berms or dikes to control the migration of that product, especially trying to keep it away from waterways. Just using sand, dirt, whatever is handy, or using absorbents as best as possible, or plastic sheeting. This is always something that should be done before calling us. Please try to stop the discharge as best you can. Obviously, if you cannot, your next step is to give us a buzz. If you've got additional resources that are needed, certainly, again, give us a call. We can work with the responsible party if they are on scene to have them retain a contractor, or more commonly, we just speak to the responsible party briefly and say, hey, we can call someone on your behalf. We will work through our list of contractors and try to identify the closest, best resource to deploy to the incident based on where they're coming from. And then back at our level, essentially from start to finish, we get notified of a release. We determine what is needed to really manage the spill on the ground, what's necessary for a cleanup. Do we need additional resources? Like I said, we can contact a contractor under retainer if there's no responsible party, or we can work with that responsible party to get them to hire someone. We will respond in person if requested or if necessary. I know in certain situations there's no request, but I will just get in the truck and go because it's a significant enough incident. We do communicate quite a bit, more so lately than we have in the past with our stakeholders, essentially our partner departments here in DEC. For example, if a spill impacts surface water that is a source water protection area for a public water system, we try our best to notify the drinking water program so they can work with the operator of that system to determine if they need to take any steps related to that water supply. We take all information that we receive from a spill or an incident, we log it all into our database, and we manage all of our files that are associated with it on our server. Those files can include photographs, emails, voicemails, ultimately on the back end, reporting, manifests for waste disposal, and ultimately, after all the response actions have been completed, any additional cleanup has been completed, and the reporting has come to us, and we know that everything's been disposed of, we can close the incident out. So that was the regulatory and operational component here, but this is a bit more the interesting side of what we do is the numbers and the actual incidents that we manage. 2023 was a bit abnormal. We typically have between 500 and 550 and 650 spills reported to us on an annual basis. Obviously, last year with the 2024 or July 2023 flooding, we had an additional 242 incidents that were managed because of impacted properties from the flooding. As usual, our top spill categories, and this is a pretty much an annual normal, above ground storage tank releases, home heating oil or even commercial heating oil tanks releasing, vehicle accidents, cargo releases, transformer related releases. Now that would be, for example, a windstorm drops a tree on a power pole that has a transformer on it. The transformer lands on the ground, spills the 10 or so gallons of mineral oil dielectric fluid that are in the transformer. We get quite a few of those every year. Hydraulic oil is another frequent flyer. In the wintertime, plow trucks, snow groomers. We get practically one a night from snow groomers at the various ski areas around the state. And in the summertime, it's more, excavation operations, excavators, dump trucks, blowing hoses, that kind of thing. And then lastly, our underground storage tanks or motor fuel tank related releases. I want to highlight one spill rather briefly here. I think I've got a little bit of time for this. This was our probably most significant incident last year outside of the flooding. This was down at the Putney paper facility in downtown Putney. In late October, they had done some facility improvements and they had upgraded their furnace that supplies heat to the plant from its, I don't know how old the thing was, but they basically installed a new furnace that was a dual fuel that relied on what they primarily use as compressed natural gas, but they had a backup of oil supply always because certain times of the year they can't get natural gas trucks in when there's bad weather, so on and so forth. They have a 30,000 gallon above ground storage tank. And for reference in the photograph that's shown here, that is a large concrete retaining wall along Sackett's Brook. And well above the heads of the firemen and the other responders, there's a pipe sticking out. And above that pipe, there's about another 10 feet of wall, which is what was the quote unquote containment for the above ground storage tank. It's a 30,000 gallon tank. So in the process of updating their furnace, they realized they were switching from heavier oils to a lighter #2 fuel oil. They hired a contractor in late October to come in and clean the tank and perform an inspection. I'm not on camera, but I'm using air quotes around the word inspection, which resulted in the owner of the tank being told that, the tank's not great, but we can see some holes up in the roof of it, but you can probably safely fill it to at least halfway and not have a spill. So on November 2nd, Putney Paper ordered 15,000 gallons of fuel oil, which was delivered to that AST. Shortly thereafter, they started noticing red-dyed fuel oil in their containment structure. The immediate response was essentially they had contractors on scene already. They began to pump fuel oil from the containment as well as from the tank. They recovered approximately 12,000 of the 15,000 gallons in that operation, but the other 3,000 gallons were essentially discharged to the containment, which was, again, air quotes, really not containment. It was built into an old retaining wall. That wall was constructed in 1918, and the top half was added on later date. The wall itself was not competent. You can see in the photo, it's not easily to see, but these were drainage holes that were installed in the wall to, allow for freezing and thawing and thermal contraction during winter. Fuel oil, as you can see, those saturated pads was emanating out the weep holes in the wall. The wall itself was not of great integrity. There were several cracks and penetrations where oil was escaping. So the initial response was essentially vacuuming out fuel from the containment in the tank, while local fire, Vermont Hazardous Materials Response Team, as well as the environmental contractor performed this oil recovery outside of the wall where it was dripping out. For context, to the right of this photograph here, just beyond this woods or these trees, there's about a 15-foot drop down to Sackett's Brook. The paper mill property is two buildings that straddle the brook. So it's in very close proximity to a surface water body. We're not exactly sure how much oil was discharged directly to the river, but there was a good slug of oil that went down Sackett's Brook in the middle of the night on November 2nd and 3rd. entered the Connecticut River. And, the reports of the people that noticed it obviously noticed a strong odor as far south as Brattleboro and the Massachusetts border. But it did not appear to be a lot of recoverable oil. It was largely a heavy sheen. The next morning, my counterpart, or one of my program members, Mike Nucci, was on call that night. He ended up deploying to Putley overnight. I grabbed the truck from him when he returned about 6 o'clock on the 3rd and headed down there myself and did a large-scale inspection of the river. We worked closely with our counterparts in New Hampshire. They provided resources to install hard boom or collection boom, curtain boom at the mouth of Sackett's Brook to essentially isolate any oil coming down Sackett's Brook from the Connecticut River. Thankfully, unfortunately, we couldn't do that night because it was nighttime and it was dangerous operations, but we got the boom out. It never really collected a lot of oil. But what we did have was sort of an ongoing persistent oil weep down at the edge of the brook up near the plant. Apparently, this tank had leaked quite a bit over the years. And what we're seeing now is not red dyed fuel oil, but older number 6, number fuel, really heavily weathered black oil, which has migrated from behind this wall into sediments and soils and are starting to bubble up and basically hit Sackett's Brook right at the edge near the plant. So after this initial response, the secondary response has been an ongoing management of absorbance on the brook, as well as some hard boom to sort of maintain any product that gets by the absorbance and keeps it up close to the plant. That response has been through the plant operations as well as their hired contractor. But as of this week, they are taking more aggressive actions to address this oil that's locked up in sediments and continually discharging. We approved a corrective action plan back in early summer, and this week they actually have excavators that they've mobilized down over the wall into the brook to install a collection trench. They're essentially going to remove as much impacted soil as they can and then install a collection trench and backfill it with recovery piping and pumps. And they're going to pump all liquid recovery up into storage tanks where they will then skim off oil for disposal, and they will treat whatever water is accumulated through activated carbon and then discharge that back to the brook under a general permit. I could probably spend a good hour and a half talking about all the details of this incident, but I just wanted to segue this into, I mentioned our database. We store a lot of the information related to spills. I don't know if all in the room, I'm sure some of the folks online are familiar with the environmental research tool. But the website here is down at the bottom of the slide. When you navigate, you will land on this search page. If you are interested in spills in your town or your region or within a specific date range, you can simply just start searching by entering a town or a date range or even just a year in a town. If you're looking for a specific facility or address, you can input that. Upon pressing search, you will usually be yielded at least one result, if not multiple, and you can click on those results for more details about the incident. I have apologized, I have not updated in a little while. We've actually transitioned this incident in Putney from a spill designation to a hazardous site designation because of the longer term and ongoing needs of management. So that's a good tool just to be able to check on what's going on in the spills world, just from a public facing perspective. And now, obviously, the other big issue last year for our program was the July 10th flood event. I know this slide's probably popped up on quite a few presentations this year, or today, that is. But it depicts really well the inundation in downtown Montpelier on the morning of July 11th. So what we did in terms of a response, a lot of us are working remotely. So we kind of started the day on the 11th, realizing that things had gone real sour. And we all started looking at various media outlets and online resources, trying to just identify what areas of the state were the hardest hit and where we would expect that we would have some involvement with releases of hazardous materials. It wasn't until that afternoon that we started getting reports from local fire departments, Vermont Emergency Management. The hazmat team was out, boots on the ground, so we were getting a lot of reports from them. Individual residents were calling us to report spills, and a lot of state contractors who do oil spill response had been contacted, directly by residents with impacts, and so they were letting us know about it. Within the first couple of days, we probably had at least 100 reports. We also mobilized on July 2nd into Montpelier and Barrie with some spill program folks, boots on the ground, basically going door to door where we could, looking for obviously oil impacted properties. Sometimes we'd come around a corner and there'd be a house pumping the oil out of their basement onto their front yard. We would work with them to make sure that we could address the spill in a more appropriate manner. Once we had a pretty substantial list of actual incident targets, we used our state contractors. We have 4 of them on retainer at that time, and we mobilized them to different regions to start working impacted properties. The central southern Vermont, Ludlow, Proctorsville area was one region. Johnson, Cambridge area was another, and then obviously Barrie and Montpelier. On day 7 of the incident, there was a federal disaster declaration that was recognized by President Biden, which enabled EPA to mobilize to Vermont with their contractors under a mission assignment. So they sort of joined the fold of our existing contractors, and we were able to work with EPA and our contractors and assign them each individual incidents and try to keep them working regionally. The services that were provided, and these were provided to impacted property owners at no charge. Costs were managed through the Vermont Petroleum Cleanup Fund. But what we would do is we would send contractors out to pump out basement ASTs or above ground storage tanks that had been compromised by floodwaters. Or if they had not released but were threatening a release, we would have the tank pumped out. We would remove oily water and oily muck and sediments from basements. And then ultimately, in some situations where oil had been pumped out into a yard or the tank had the contents had released in the basement and the water came out through a window or whatever and impacted their yard, we excavated those petroleum contaminated soils, brought in some backfill, and put down some seed. So that was kind of the extent of the services that we were able to provide. All this waste, we had 242 incidents, and to manage each individual waste stream for 242 incidents was a bit of a chore, and it was taking away from time from actually doing the work of cleaning up properties. So we essentially coordinated the management and disposal of contaminated soil and oily water. And we did that by establishing various locations around the state to consolidate these wastes. Liquids were placed in the 20,000 gallon fractionation tanks, and we established some bermed and polylined disposal areas for contaminated sediments and soils. We also coordinated a household hazardous waste collection event in Middlesex. A lot of the properties that had been flooded had things like paints and other various household hazardous materials in basements that had released and or the containers had been damaged. So we essentially stood up a collection event in Middlesex. It lasted 4 or 5 weeks. It was open to the public. People came in routinely. We had one of our contractors peel away from incident response to manage the household hazardous waste piece. And lastly, we got a lot of other random reports that weren't very succinct or obvious impacts, but they were nonetheless things that we need to look at. These included just random odors and sheens on surface water. And we had plenty of abandoned barrels, tanks, drums, whatever that were, had been in surface water that landed in people's fields or were still in surface water. And we went and checked those out, or we had our contractors go check them out to see if there was actually a release of a hazardous material. So to illustrate some of what we were doing, of course, I've got a few photographs. Here on the right, this is a oil basement. Their tank let loose, and this is probably at least 100 gallons of heating oil floating on the water in their basement, the floodwaters in their basement. That's a pretty common scene in downtown Montpelier and Barrie back in July 2023. Here on the left, you may be wondering why there's snow on the ground in July. This was actually a secondary response to one of the July flood events. This was in Middlesex. We had a property that was impacted, mobilized our contractors out there. They cleaned out the basement, but unfortunately, I think we felt like the tank was empty. However, there was some residual fuel in the tank. And in mid-December, I think it was the 13th or the 14th, there was a localized rain event that hit Washington County pretty hard. And unfortunately, this poor property owner was once again flooded by the same brook, and the residual oil that was in their tank was discharged by their sump pump out here to their roadside drainage ditch right along Route 2. I picked up the pager that morning. It was a Wednesday, and immediately got a call from the Middlesex DPW guys who alerted me to red-dyed fuel oil on the side of the road. So it was sort of a second punch from the July 2023 event. On the right, another oiled basement with a AST that appears to be in fine shape. But in some way, shape, or form, the tank was flooded, displacing the oil out one of the openings in the tank. So the tank itself looks fine, but there's obviously a big cleanup that needed to be done in that basement. We also had some commercial properties, both in Montpelier and Barre, that were impacted. This is one of the granite sheds, and I can't recall if that was waste oil or hydraulic fluid or fuel oil or a mix of all of those things. That was one cleanup that was done by EPA. Contrary to that prior photo, these were some tanks that were in flood incidents. The ones on the left here were two manifolded 275-gallon above ground storage tanks, which appeared to have actually been installed in a containment structure. But ultimately, when there's 8 feet of water in the basement, those things will float and turn topsy-turvy, breaking piping, breaking connections, breaking valves, and releasing fluids. On the right, we have a property in Barre. This beige house, they were not the owner of that shed and that oil tank that landed in their yard. There was a discussion earlier in one of the talks about landslides. This was a property that had a landslide. It was a mobile home. The gentleman, fortunately, was about to walk out his door when the landslide occurred. He took a bit of a ride inside of his house. It pivoted 90 degrees and moved about 50 feet. And then his shed and his oil tank moved about another 100 feet down the hill, where it came into contact with this residential property. Unfortunately, that tank landed upside down, and all the contents of the tank bled out into soils. Some of the oil got into the basement of this residence. That was one of our more involved cleanups. Given the nature of impacts, we could not excavate all contaminated soil, so we ultimately looked at groundwater impacts and the potential for vapor intrusion into the structure before we were able to close that one out. Mentioned the kind of random aspect of it. Obviously cars and other vessels in surface waters. Somebody's car in a river here. I do not know where that one is. I believe this was down in Chester. This was a former above ground storage tank, which had been repurposed as an above ground storage tank. It was displaced from the property where it originally lived and landed here on this other person's property. We did assess that one and determined that there was no actual petroleum contamination associated. So that one kind of just became part of the debris removal component of the flood response. Exterior impacts. On the left here, we have a residential property whose basement flooded. They had their tank released, and this black line here is their sump pump discharge. So the sump pump kicked on, evacuated all the liquids from the basement, including the oil, which stained the grass here, killed the grass. These were relatively easy to address because there was great visual indicators of where there was contamination. So our contractors could easily get in there and dig that up and get it restored within a day. On the right, I believe this is a mobile home park in Berlin, and this is Berlin fire after some floodwaters had abated early in the morning of the 11th. And this is just another tactic, obviously deploying absorbent pads and absorbent boom to pick up any oil that has been discharged. That one later required soil excavation. Culvert here on the left is a culvert that discharges into the north branch of the Winooski in Montpelier. It had a really weird colored oil. None of us could readily identify exactly what type of oil it was. And as we traced the catch basin lines back up towards Main Street, we didn't find any oil in any of the catch basins. So this one was a bit of a head scratcher, and it continued to discharge for a few days. But that was a pretty standard response tactic, and it can be employed in any situation where you have surface water impacts. Is just getting some absorbents in there to prevent any migration of the oil out of the culvert or out of the side channel and into the main stem of the surface water body. On the right, going back to property impacts, this was a residential structure that was flooded, had a basement oil tank release. After waters were removed and all the oily materials and debris, like personal belongings and such, were removed, our contractors would go in with a vac truck or a large vacuum mounted on a truck, in layman's terms, and they would essentially excavate with the vacuum all the contaminated muck and sediments that accumulated inside the structures with the floodwaters. In terms of consolidation locations, on the left here, we have one of our sediment and oily soil accumulation locations. This was the Waterbury office complex State Office Complex in Waterbury. Essentially, once we had done consolidating material there, we had our contractor come in and characterize it for disposal and then ultimately ship it off in trucks for final disposal. Unfortunately, we have the same situation going on in that same exact spot right now. And lastly, here on the right is our household hazardous waste collection event area in Middlesex. This was at the former police barracks there on Route 2. And no, those aren't spills. It just happened to be taken after some rain, the photo that was. In terms of our consolidation locations, we tried to locate things as close as possible to where we had impacted properties. So in Johnson, we stood up an oily water accumulation location at the Lamoille Union High School. We also graciously had assistance from one of the local gravel pits who allowed us to stage contaminated soils and sediment on their property, which was great because as the contractors did excavation work, they could go deposit the oily soil, fill up with a load of clean backfill, and come up and keep working on the project. Down in Ludlow, we established a frac tank location in one of the Okemo Mountain Ski Resort parking lots for oily water accumulation. Waterbury, we just saw the picture of the sediments. Barry, one of our contractors is out of Barry, and they established a oily water collection location at their shop. And then again, in Middlesex was our household hazardous waste location. So all in all, we spent a good part of July, August, and September last year just dealing with incident-specific responses, as well as the overall big picture of managing the final waste out the door for disposal. And during the response, those of us involved, heavily involved, took a lot of notes, and we certainly started thinking about how to plan better for the next time. We conducted a hot wash afterwards with our state contractors, and we also conducted an independent hot wash with EPA just to kind of go over strengths and weaknesses and what went well, what didn't work well. A lot of what we landed on from the hot washes was communication improvements. We took all that information and we developed, and I know this is incorrect, it says in January 2024, but we started drafting in January 2024, or actually December 23, our disaster emergency response plan for the Waste Management and Prevention Division. We finalized the plan this May, and basically it's a high-level overview of our response capabilities and our responsibilities when we have a natural disaster or another significant weather event. Importantly, it provides an overall timeline of what we will do when a disaster event occurs, and it actually starts at day -1 for when a disaster is anticipated. There's a big emphasis on communications, both internally and externally. I mean, as you all can imagine, it's a large agent or a large department, the environmental conservation, and we're under agency and natural resources. So during these types of events, there's a lot of internal agency communication that's going on. But also externally, we have a lot of fact sheets and information that we try to get out to the public. When we were doing canvassing, people would have handouts in hand to be able to give them the property owners, things that talked about household hazardous waste, oil spill response, and even debris management. We tried to get that out by going door to door, as well as getting those materials to disaster recovery centers that were established in hard-hit areas like Montpelier and Barrie. The plan also includes, essentially establishes our ICS, our incident command system structure for how we're going to stand up our staff to manage these incidents from our perspective. And it also provides for a training plan based on our staff level roles in the ICS as we stand up an emergency operations center. We've also decided that everyone in the Waste Management Prevention Division is going to take basic awareness of Incident Command System and National Incident Management System trainings, just so that they understand how we are operating in the ICS world, because in the ICS world, your usual boss may not be your boss. And so that was difficult for some people who were sort of on the sidelines to understand what was going on. So we have a lot of appendices with all this great information in there, but from a high level, we feel good about the plan. Pardon me. In June, I requested to our staff, I put out an email and said, hey, who would like to have a role in our emergency operations center when it's stood up? Please get back to me, get confirmation from your supervisor. It's something you can take on because it's going to be a duty outside of your normal assigned program duties. I provided a deadline of, I think it was July 6th or 7th for people to get that information to me this year. On Monday or Tuesday, July 9th, 8th or 9th, I was starting to organize that information and start assigning staffing roles and figuring out what training is required for those roles. And then it happened again. So right as we were getting prepared to sort of really implement our disaster emergency response plan, post-tropical storm Beryl hit again on the anniversary of the 2023 events. And then subsequently, we had the unnamed storm event on July 30th, which largely impacted Caledonia County, St. Johnsbury, Linden area. These storms this year were certainly as significant as the storms last year in terms of impacts to properties. However, they were both a little bit different. In 2023, we had a lot more inundation type events, whereas we had so many properties in Montpelier and Barre that were flooded out. Whereas this year, as you all are very well aware, I'm sure, it was a lot of infrastructure, roadway, stream channel, bridges, culverts that were destroyed. That doesn't mean that we didn't have private properties and such that were impacted by floodwaters, and we certainly had some oil spills associated with those impacts. Certainly to a lesser degree in terms of numbers. We've only received 53 calls for this summer's flooding events, 42 from Beryl and 11 from the 730 rain event, which is only about 20% of what we dealt with last year. And I mean, I think we're all very thankful for a number of reasons that we didn't have to go through another large scale event in terms of oil impacts this summer right after last year's. We did utilize our disaster emergency response plan as best as we possibly could during this response. And it's essentially we utilized the same exact field response tactics that we did last summer. We stood up some contractors to manage certain areas as best as possible. We established collection locations for contaminated sediments and water. And it's also very similar to what we did during Tropical Storm Irene in 2011. I was not a member of the spill program at that time. In fact, I didn't even work for DEC back then. But it's essentially the same response. But unfortunately, nobody really ever memorialized it back in 2011. So we realized that last year, and that's why we sort of worked on doing this planning and looking ahead to what's coming down the road for us. I realize I'm probably over time. I can skip this, but ultimately we've got a few new things on our radar. PFAS, perfluoroalkyl substances. We've had 3 significant Class B HFFF foam releases this year that we've been managing. Obviously, the increased frequency of these significant and severe weather events and information sharing. We are now being tasked with a lot more notification to other agencies and departments for spills that impact certain types of environmental media. That's something that we haven't really had to deal with historically. So that is all I have. Do we have any questions?